The bullet that grazed Samuel Carter's shoulder in the spring of 1878 was meant for the man who owed him $300. But instead, it sent him sprawling face-first into the dusty street of Dodge City, Kansas, his Bible skittering across the ground and landing at the feet of a woman whose green eyes would change everything he thought he knew about loneliness. Samuel had been a cowboy for 7 years, ever since he turned 18 and left his family's failing farm in Missouri with nothing but his father's worn saddle and his mother's final gift, a leather-bound Bible with his name embossed in gold letters on the cover. He had learned quickly that the cattle trails were unforgiving, that men died from rattlesnake bites and stampedes and bad water, and that most cowboys spent their evenings drinking away the memories of everything they had lost. But Samuel had made himself a promise on that first night under the stars, watching the cattle settle and listening to the old hands tell their stories of regret. He would not become a man who forgot where he came from or who had raised him with love and faith. Every meal, whether it was beans cooked over a campfire or a plate of steak and eggs in a saloon, Samuel bowed his head and said grace. The other cowboys had mocked him at first, calling him preacher and Saint Sam, but he never wavered. He folded his hands, closed his eyes, and thanked God for the food before him, for the strength in his body, and for another day of life. Always his prayer ended the same way. Lord, I thank you for this meal set before me, for one. It was a simple acknowledgement of his solitary existence, a reminder that he ate alone even when surrounded by others, that his life was his own and no one else's to share. The woman who picked up his Bible had auburn hair that caught the afternoon sunlight like copper wire, and her hands were steady despite the gunfire that had just erupted 20 feet away. Samuel pushed himself up from the dirt, his shoulder burning where the bullet had torn through his shirt and left a bloody furrow across his skin. The shooter was already galloping out of town, and the man who owed Samuel money was clutching his own arm and cursing loud enough to wake the dead. But Samuel's attention was fixed on the woman holding his most precious possession. "This yours?" she asked, her voice carrying a trace of an accent he could not quite place. "Eastern, maybe. Educated?" "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said, taking his hat off despite the pain radiating through his shoulder. "I'm obliged to you for retrieving it." She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts concern and curiosity, her gaze dropping to the blood seeping through his shirt. "You are injured. That wound needs tending." "It is nothing serious," Samuel said, though the throbbing suggested otherwise. "I have had worse." "I am certain you have, given your profession," she said, and there was something in her tone that was not quite disapproval but close to it. She held out the Bible, and when he reached for it, she did not immediately let go. "A cowboy who carries scripture, that is unusual." "I reckon faith is not restricted to any particular occupation, ma'am," Samuel said, meeting her eyes. Up close, he could see that they were not simply green but flecked with gold, like a forest floor dappled with sunlight. "I suppose not," she said, releasing the Bible. "Though I have met precious few men in this town who demonstrate any evidence of it." Before Samuel could respond, an older woman appeared behind her, gray-haired and stern-faced, wearing a dress that marked her as someone with means. "Eleanor, we must return to the hotel immediately. This violence is precisely why I warned you against wandering the streets unescorted. Eleanor." The name fit her somehow, Samuel thought. It had a dignity to it, a refinement that matched the way she held herself. "I was not wandering, Aunt Margaret," Eleanor said patiently. "I was walking directly from the general store to the hotel when this gentleman was shot." "He is a cowboy, not a gentleman," Aunt Margaret said sharply, though she did spare Samuel a quick glance that took in his bloody shoulder. "And you should not be speaking with him regardless." Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she turned back to Samuel with a slight nod. "I hope your wound heals quickly, sir." "Thank you kindly, ma'am," Samuel said, settling his hat back on his head and watching as the two women walked away, Aunt Margaret's hand firmly on Aliner's elbow as though steering a ship through dangerous waters. Samuel made his way to the doctor's office, a cramped room above the barber shop that smelled of carbolic acid and whiskey. Doc Brennan was a gruff man in his 60s who had seen every kind of injury the frontier could inflict, and he cleaned and bandaged Samuel's shoulder with efficient, unsympathetic hands. "You are lucky it just grazed you," Brennan said, tying off the bandage. "Another inch to the right and it would have shattered your collarbone. You would have been done working cattle." "I am aware," Samuel said, flexing his arm carefully and wincing at the pull of torn muscle. "What started it this time?" Brennan asked, washing his hands in a basin. "Tom Merkel owed me money for helping drive his herd to the railhead last month. When I asked for payment, his brother took exception to my timing. The Merkels are trouble," Brennan said. "You would be wise to write off that debt and stay clear of them." "I worked for that money," Samuel said quietly. "I do not intend to let it go." "Suit yourself," Brennan said, "but do not come crying to me when they put a bullet somewhere more permanent next time." Samuel paid the doctor with coins from his dwindling funds and stepped back out into the late afternoon heat. Dodge City was in its prime in 1878, a cattle town swollen with Texas longhorns and the men who drove them north. The streets were a chaos of saloons and gambling halls, dance houses and brothels, all designed to separate cowboys from their wages as quickly as possible. Samuel had learned to avoid most of the temptations, spending his money on necessities and saving the rest in a leather pouch he kept hidden in his saddlebag. He had a dream, vague and distant, of buying his own land someday, of building something permanent instead of drifting from job to job. He found lodging at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Cooper, a practical woman who did not allow drinking or gambling under her roof, and therefore attracted a quieter sort of clientele. Samuel paid for a week in advance and carried his gear up to a small room that contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the street. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened his Bible, turning to the passage his mother had marked years ago in Proverbs. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." He had been leaning on his own understanding for 7 years now, making his way through a world that valued strength and skill over kindness or faith. But he had not abandoned the principles his parents had instilled in him, even when doing so would have been easier. Every meal, he said grace. Every Sunday, if he was near a town, he attended church. Every night, he read scripture before sleeping. These rituals were the scaffolding that held his life together, the reminder that he was more than just a hired hand moving cattle across endless plains. That evening, he went to the hotel dining room for supper, a rare indulgence made possible by the payment he should have received from Tom Merkel. The room was crowded with cattlemen and merchants, and the air was thick with cigar smoke and conversation. Samuel found a small table near the window and ordered beef stew and cornbread. When the food arrived, he bowed his head and clasped his hands. "Lord, I thank you for this meal set before me, for one," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the din. "I thank you for your protection today and for the healing you will bring to my body. Guide my steps and keep me in your grace. Amen." When he opened his eyes, he found Alina watching him from across the room. She was seated at a larger table with her aunt and 2 men Samuel did not recognize, both wearing suits that marked them as businessmen of some sort. Alina's gaze was steady and thoughtful, and when their eyes met, she did not look away or pretend she had been observing something else. She simply held his gaze for a long moment before turning back to her companions. Samuel ate his meal slowly, aware of her presence in a way that made him uncomfortable. He was not accustomed to being noticed by women of her obvious station. The women he encountered were typically saloon girls or the weathered wives of settlers, and none of them had ever looked at him the way Alina had, with that mixture of curiosity and something else he could not quite identify. He finished his meal and paid his bill, nodding respectfully in Aliner's direction as he left. She returned the nod with a small, almost secretive smile that followed him out into the night. Over the next few days, Samuel healed quickly, the wound on his shoulder scabbing over and itching fiercely as new skin formed beneath the bandage. He took odd jobs around town, helping unload freight wagons and repairing fences for the livery stable, anything to earn money while he waited for the next cattle drive to form. He avoided the Merkles and heard through town gossip that they had left Dodge City, heading south toward Texas. The $300 they owed him was gone, a loss he could ill afford but one he accepted with resignation. Some battles were not worth fighting, especially when the odds were stacked against you. He saw Aliner 3 more times during that week, always from a distance. Once, she was emerging from the general store with packages in her arms. Once, she was walking with her aunt along the boardwalk, her parasol shading her face from the harsh sun. And once, she was standing outside the church on Sunday morning, speaking with the minister's wife. Each time, Samuel tipped his hat, and each time she acknowledged him with that same small smile that suggested she remembered him. It was on the 8th day after the shooting that she approached him directly. Samuel was at the livery stable, brushing down a mare that had thrown a shoe, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Aliner standing in the doorway, backlit by the morning sun so that her hair glowed like a halo. "I apologize for intruding," she said, stepping into the dimness of the stable. "I was told I might find you here." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said, setting down the brush and wiping his hands on his trousers. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I have a somewhat unusual request," Aliner said, folding her hands in front of her. "I am in need of an escort and you strike me as someone who might be trustworthy." Samuel blinked, surprised. "An escort, ma'am, to where?" "My aunt and I came to Dodge City to settle my late uncle's estate," Aliner explained. "He owned a ranch approximately 30 miles west of here, near the Cimarron River. I wish to see the property before we finalize the sale, but my aunt refuses to make the journey. She considers it too dangerous." "She is not wrong," Samuel said carefully. "That territory can be rough. There are still occasional raids and the route takes you through some isolated country." "Which is precisely why I am asking you," Aliner said. "I saw you reading your Bible yesterday morning in the hotel lobby. I heard you say grace before breakfast, just as you did the first night I saw you. A man who prays is a man who has a conscience, and a man with a conscience can be trusted." Samuel was taken aback by the directness of her reasoning. "I am flattered by your confidence, ma'am, but hiring me to escort you alone would be improper. Your aunt would never allow it." "My aunt need not know," Aliner said, and there was a spark of defiance in her eyes that told Samuel she was accustomed to making her own decisions, whether others approved or not. "I will tell her I am spending the day with the minister's wife, visiting the sick. You and I will ride out at dawn, view the property, and return before sunset. She will be none the wiser." "And if something happens to you," Samuel asked, "if we encounter trouble and you are harmed?" "Then I accept that risk," Aliner said firmly. "I am not a child, Mr. Carter. I am 23 years old, and I have traveled extensively with my father before his death 2 years ago. I can ride, I can shoot, and I am not prone to hysterics. What I lack is familiarity with this particular territory and someone who knows how to navigate it safely." Samuel studied her, noting the determination in her posture and the intelligence in her eyes. She was not asking on a whim, she had clearly thought this through. "Why does it matter if you see the property?" he asked. "If you are selling it, what difference does it make?" Aliner hesitated, and for the first time, her certainty wavered. "My uncle was my father's younger brother. I never met him, but my father spoke of him often, always with regret that they had become estranged. When I learned of his death and that he had left the ranch to me, I felt I owed it to both of them to see what he built here. My aunt simply wants to sell and return to Boston as quickly as possible, but I need to understand what I am giving up before I make that decision." It was the mention of family obligation that decided Samuel. He understood regret and the weight of honoring the dead. His own parents had passed within a year of each other, his father from a fever and his mother from the heartbreak of losing him, and Samuel still carried the guilt of not being there when they died. "I will take you," he said, "but we do this properly. We leave at first light, we stay together at all times, and at the first sign of trouble we turn back." "Agreed, agreed," Alina said, and her smile was radiant with relief. "I will pay you, of course, $20 for the day." It was more than generous, more than Samuel would have asked for, and he suspected she knew that. "10 is fair," he said. "20," Alina insisted. "You are not only serving as a guide but also taking a risk on my behalf. $20, Mr. Carter, and I will hear no argument." Samuel nodded, unable to suppress a slight smile. "Yes, ma'am, $20 it is." They agreed to meet at the edge of town, near the old cottonwood that marked the Western Trail. Samuel spent the rest of the day preparing, checking his horse's shoes, cleaning his rifle, and packing supplies for the journey. He also spent a considerable amount of time wondering if he was making a mistake. Escorting an unmarried woman alone into the prairie was the kind of thing that could ruin both their reputations if anyone discovered the truth, and he had no doubt that Aunt Margaret would have strong opinions on the matter. But when he arrived at the cottonwood the next morning, just as the first gray light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, and saw Alina waiting for him dressed in a practical riding skirt and jacket, her hair braided and pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, he knew he would not turn back. There was something about her that called to a part of him he had thought long buried, a part that wanted connection and companionship instead of solitude. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said, swinging up into her saddle with easy grace. "Good morning, Miss Alina," Samuel replied, noting the quality of her horse, a chestnut gelding that looked well-bred and well cared for. "Are you ready?" "I have been ready since I woke at 4 this morning," she said with a laugh. "Lead the way." They rode west as the sun climbed, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that gradually gave way to the fierce blue of a Kansas summer day. The land stretched out before them in rolling waves of prairie grass, broken occasionally by stands of cottonwood or clusters of wildflowers that added splashes of color to the monotonous landscape. Samuel kept a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, but the morning remained peaceful. Alina was a skilled rider, he noted with approval. She kept her seat easily and did not complain when the pace quickened or when they had to navigate rougher terrain. For the first hour they rode in companionable silence, but as the sun grew hotter and the landscape more familiar, she began to ask questions. "How long have you been a cowboy, Mr. Carter?" "7 years, ma'am, since I was 18. "And do you enjoy the work?" Samuel considered the question. "It is hard and often dangerous, but there is a freedom to it that suits me. I like working with animals and I like being outdoors. I would not choose to spend my life in an office or a factory." "Yet you carry a Bible and say grace at every meal," Alina observed. "That suggests you value more than just freedom and open sky." "My parents raised me to believe that faith and hard work go hand in hand," Samuel said. "One does not exclude the other." "My father believed something similar," Alina said softly. "He was a professor of literature, but he reads scripture every morning and attended church every Sunday without fail. After he died, my aunt insisted I come live with her in Boston. She is well-meaning but deeply conservative. She believes a woman's role is to marry well and manage a household, nothing more." "And you do not agree?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "I believe a woman should have the opportunity to choose her own path," Alina said firmly. "I taught school in Boston for a year, but my aunt found it unseemly and pressured me to resign. She has been introducing me to every eligible bachelor in her social circle, hoping I will settle on one and forget about such frivolous pursuits as education or independence." "Is that why you wanted to see your uncle's ranch?" Samuel asked. Because it represents another option. Eleanor glanced at him, surprised. You are perceptive, Mr. Carter. Yes, that is part of it. I have been living according to other people's expectations for 2 years now, and I am weary of it. When I learned about the ranch, I thought perhaps I might keep it, might even try to make a life here. But I know nothing about ranching, and my aunt would disown me if I attempted such a thing. Ranching is hard work, Samuel said honestly. It requires knowledge and experience, not to mention capital. If your uncle's property has been sitting unattended since his death, it is likely in disrepair. You would be starting from a difficult position. I suspected as much, Eleanor said with a sigh. But it was a pleasant dream while it lasted. They stopped at midday beside a creek, letting the horses drink while they ate the simple lunch Samuel had packed: bread, cheese, and dried apples. Samuel bowed his head before eating, and Eleanor watched him with that same thoughtful expression he had noticed before. Lord, I thank you for this meal set before me, for one, Samuel began, then paused. He opened one eye and glanced at Eleanor. For two, he amended and continued his prayer. I thank you for safe travel this morning and for good weather. Watch over us as we continue our journey. Amen. When he looked up, Eleanor was smiling. That was kind of you to include me. It would have been rude not to, Samuel said, feeling unaccountably self-conscious. Do you always pray for one? She asked. I have heard you do so several times now, Samuel nodded, tearing off a piece of bread. It is a reminder that I am alone. Not lonely necessarily, but alone. I have no family left, no wife or children, just myself and God. That sounds lonely to me, Eleanor said gently. Do you not wish for companionship? I suppose I do, Samuel admitted, but this life does not lend itself to forming lasting attachments. I am on the move most of the year, and the women I encounter are rarely interested in a cowboy with more debts than prospects. Then they are foolish, Eleanor said matter-of-factly. You are clearly a man of integrity and faith. Those qualities are far rarer and more valuable than money. Samuel did not know how to respond to that, so he simply inclined his head and continued eating. But her words stayed with him, warming something in his chest that had been cold for a very long time. They reached the ranch in the early afternoon. It was a modest spread, with a small cabin, a barn that was listing slightly to one side, and corrals that needed repair. The land itself was good, though, with access to water and enough grazing to support a decent herd. Samuel could see the potential in it, even in its current neglected state. Eleanor dismounted and walked slowly toward the cabin, her expression a mixture of sadness and curiosity. Samuel followed, keeping a respectful distance as she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was dusty and dim, furnished simply with a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a stove. Personal belongings were still scattered about. A shaving kit on a shelf, a coat hanging on a peg, a half-finished letter on the table. It was clear that Eleanor's uncle had died suddenly, without time to set his affairs in order. Eleanor picked up the letter and read it silently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He was writing to my father, she said quietly, apologizing for their estrangement and saying he hoped they could reconcile. He never got to finish it. Samuel stepped closer, reading over her shoulder. The handwriting was shaky but sincere, the words of a man who regretted the years lost to pride and stubbornness. He would have wanted you to have this place, Samuel said. He left it to you for a reason. But I cannot keep it, Eleanor said, setting the letter down with a sigh. I do not have the knowledge or resources to run a ranch, and my aunt would never allow it. I will have to sell as she wants. You could hire someone to manage it for you, Samuel suggested. Keep ownership, but let someone else handle the day-to-day operations. That way, you honor your uncle's wishes without giving up your life in Boston. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes bright with sudden hope. That is a possibility I had not considered. Do you know of anyone who might be interested in such an arrangement? Samuel hesitated. The idea had formed in his mind even as he spoke, but he had not intended to propose himself. Yet standing here in the dusty cabin, looking at Eleanor's hopeful expression, he found himself saying, I could do it. You, Eleanor said, surprised. I have been looking for an opportunity to settle somewhere, Samuel explained. To build something permanent instead of drifting from job to job. If you were willing to hire me as a manager, I could repair the buildings, build up a herd, and send you a share of the profits. It would give you income and preserve the property in case you ever decided you wanted to return. Eleanor stared at him, and Samuel could see the thoughts racing behind her eyes. You would do that? Commit to staying here, working this land for someone you barely know? I would do it for the opportunity, Samuel said honestly. And because I believe it is what your uncle would have wanted. This place deserves a chance, and so do you. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then she stepped forward and extended her hand. All right, Mr. Carter, if you are willing, then I am willing. We will draw up a contract when we return to Dodge City. You will manage the ranch and we will split the profits fairly. Does that sound agreeable? Samuel took her hand, feeling the warmth of her palm against his. It sounds more than agreeable, Miss Eleanor. It sounds like the answer to a prayer I did not know I was praying. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking the property, with Samuel pointing out what needed immediate repair and what could wait. Eleanor listened intently, asking intelligent questions and taking notes in a small leather journal she produced from her saddlebag. By the time they mounted their horses to return to Dodge City, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, and Samuel felt a sense of purpose he had not experienced in years. The ride back was quieter than the journey out, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who had reached an understanding. As they neared the town, Eleanor turned to him. Thank you, Mr. Carter, not just for today, but for offering me a solution I could not have found on my own. You have given me hope that I can honor my uncle's memory while still maintaining some degree of independence. I should be thanking you, Samuel said. You have given me a chance to prove myself, to build something that matters. I will not let you down. I have no doubt of that, Eleanor said with a smile. A man who says grace before every meal is a man who keeps his promises. They parted ways at the edge of town, Eleanor heading back to the hotel while Samuel returned to the boarding house. But before she left, she looked back at him one more time. Will I see you tomorrow to discuss the contract? Yes, ma'am, Samuel said. I will call on you at the hotel in the morning if that is acceptable. It is more than acceptable, Eleanor said. Good night, Mr. Carter. Good night, Miss Eleanor. Samuel watched her ride away, her figure silhouetted against the fading light, and felt something shift inside him. It was more than just gratitude or excitement about the opportunity she had offered. It was something deeper, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. He recognized it with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. He was falling in love with Eleanor Whitman. That night, as he lay in his narrow bed, Samuel prayed longer than usual. He thanked God for the opportunity that had been placed before him, for Eleanor's trust and kindness, and for the chance to build a future. But he also prayed for wisdom, because he knew that his growing feelings for Eleanor were complicated by the vast differences in their stations and circumstances. She was educated, refined, from a world of privilege that he could barely imagine. He was a cowboy, a hired hand with nothing to his name but a horse, a saddle, and his faith. Still, as he drifted off to sleep, he could not help but smile at the memory of her face when she had agreed to his proposal, the way her eyes had lit up with hope and determination. The next morning, Samuel dressed in his cleanest clothes and walked to the hotel. He found Eleanor in the lobby, seated at a small writing desk with papers spread before her. Aunt Margaret was nowhere in sight, for which Samuel was grateful. Good morning, Mr. Carter, Eleanor said, rising to greet him. I have been drafting a contract based on our conversation yesterday. Would you care to review it? They spent the next hour going over the details, negotiating terms that were fair to both parties. Eleanor would retain ownership of the property and receive 30% of any profits from cattle sales, while Samuel would keep 70% to cover his labor and investment in rebuilding the ranch. He would have full authority to make decisions regarding the operation, with the understanding that he would provide Alina with quarterly reports on the ranch's progress. It was a generous arrangement, one that gave Samuel both responsibility and opportunity. He signed the contract with a sense of solemnity, aware that he was committing himself to something that would define the next chapter of his life. "I will have this witnessed and filed with the land office," Alina said, carefully blotting the ink. "You should be able to take possession of the property within a week." "I will begin gathering supplies and equipment immediately," Samuel said. "The sooner I can start repairs, the sooner we can begin building a herd." "I have faith in you," Alina said, and the simple sincerity of the statement made Samuel's heart contract painfully in his chest. Over the next week, Samuel threw himself into preparations. He purchased lumber, nails, and tools, along with basic provisions to sustain him once he moved to the ranch. He also hired 2 young men, brothers named Jack and Tom Riley, who had just arrived in Dodge City looking for work. They were inexperienced but eager to learn, and Samuel appreciated their enthusiasm. During that week, he saw Alina every day. Sometimes it was a brief encounter in the street, where they would exchange pleasantries and updates on the contract paperwork. Other times, it was a longer conversation over coffee in the hotel dining room, where they talked about everything from ranch management to literature to their respective childhoods. Samuel learned that Alina had grown up in Philadelphia, the only child of parents who had encouraged her education and independence. She had attended a women's seminary and had dreams of becoming a teacher before her father's death had upended her life. In turn, Samuel shared stories of his own upbringing on the Missouri farm, of his parents' quiet faith and their determination to raise him with strong moral principles despite their poverty. He told her about his first cattle drive, about the fear and exhilaration of crossing rivers swollen with spring runoff and sleeping under stars so numerous they seemed to merge into a single sheet of light. With each conversation, Samuel felt the connection between them deepening, and he could see in Alina's eyes that she felt it too. But neither of them spoke of it directly, perhaps because acknowledging it would force them to confront the impossibility of their situation. She was meant to return to Boston with her aunt. He was committed to building a life on the Kansas prairie. Their paths had intersected briefly, beautifully, but they were not destined to merge. On the day before Samuel was to leave for the ranch, Alina asked if he would join her for dinner at the hotel. It was a bold invitation, one that raised eyebrows among the other guests, but Alina seemed unconcerned with propriety. Aunt Margaret was dining with business associates that evening, giving them a rare opportunity to speak privately. They sat at a table near the window, watching the sun set over the town in a blaze of orange and crimson. Samuel ordered steak, and Alina chose chicken with roasted vegetables. When the food arrived, Samuel automatically bowed his head to pray. "Lord, I thank you for this meal set before me," he began, and then paused. He looked across the table at Alina, who was watching him with those remarkable green eyes, and felt his heart swell with emotion. "For 2, he continued, his voice catching slightly. "I thank you for bringing Miss Alina into my life, for her kindness and trust. I thank you for the opportunity you have given me to build something meaningful. Watch over us both in the days ahead. Amen." When he opened his eyes, Alina was smiling, but there were tears glistening on her lashes. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "It was the truth," Samuel said simply. They ate slowly, savoring both the food and the companionship. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences and shared laughter. As the meal drew to a close, Alina set down her fork and looked at him with an expression of profound sadness. "I am supposed to leave for Boston in 3 days," she said. "My aunt has made all the arrangements." "I know," Samuel said, though the knowledge felt like a stone in his stomach. "I do not want to go," Alina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These past 2 weeks have been the happiest I have had in years." I feel more myself here, more alive than I ever did in Boston." "Then stay," Samuel said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Stay here, stay with me." Alina's eyes widened. "Samuel, I cannot simply abandon my aunt and my responsibilities, and even if I could, what would I do? How would I live?" "You could live on the ranch," Samuel said, leaning forward. "Not as an owner making decisions from afar, but as a partner. We could build it together. I know it would be hard work, and I know it is not the life you are accustomed to, but it would be honest and good, and we would be together." "Together," Alina repeated, and the words seemed to hang in the air between them, weighted with possibility and longing. "I have no right to ask this of you," Samuel said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I am just a cowboy with nothing to offer but hard work and faith, but I am falling in love with you, Alina. I think I have been since the moment you picked up my Bible in the street. And if there is even the smallest chance that you might feel the same way, then I am asking you to give us that chance." Alina's hand trembled in his, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then she turned her palm upward, interlacing her fingers with his. "I do feel the same way," she said, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming down her face. "I love you, Samuel. I love your integrity and your faith and your kindness. I love the way you see the world and the way you make me want to be braver than I am." "Then stay," Samuel said again, squeezing her hand gently. "Marry me. Let us build a life together on that ranch, a life that belongs to both of us." Alina drew in a shaky breath, and Samuel could see the war playing out behind her eyes, the pull between duty and desire, safety and risk. Finally she spoke. "I will stay," she said, "but I need time to speak with my aunt to make her understand, and I need you to promise me that you will be patient, that you will not give up if this becomes difficult." "I promise," Samuel said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I will wait as long as it takes." They left the hotel together, walking slowly through the darkening streets. At the door to her room, Alina turned to face him, rising on her toes to press a kiss to his cheek. "Good night, Samuel. Thank you for being brave enough to say what I was too afraid to say myself." "Good night, Alina," Samuel said, his cheek burning where her lips had touched. "I will see you tomorrow." But tomorrow brought complications that neither of them had anticipated. Samuel arrived at the hotel in the late morning to find Aunt Margaret waiting in the lobby, her expression thunderous. "Mr. Carter," she said coldly, "I would like a word with you." Samuel removed his hat and followed her to a quiet corner of the lobby, his stomach sinking. "Yes, ma'am." "Alina has informed me of your proposal," Aunt Margaret said, her voice low and furious. "I want you to understand that I find it outrageous and inappropriate. You are taking advantage of a young woman who is grieving and vulnerable, and I will not allow it." "With respect, ma'am, I am not taking advantage of anyone," Samuel said firmly. "I love your niece and I believe she loves me. I am offering her a life where she can be happy and independent, which is more than she has had in Boston." "Happy?" Aunt Margaret scoffed. "You think dragging her out to some God-forsaken ranch in the middle of nowhere will make her happy? You will ruin her, Mr. Carter. She will lose everything, her social standing, her prospects, her reputation. Is that what you want for her?" "I want her to choose her own path," Samuel said. "And if she chooses me, then I will spend the rest of my life making sure she never regrets it." "You are delusional," Aunt Margaret said harshly. "Alina has been sheltered and indulged, but she is not equipped for the harsh realities of frontier life. She will realize her mistake within a month and resent you for encouraging this foolishness." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Perhaps you should let Alina make that decision for herself, ma'am. She is an adult, not a child who needs to be protected from her own choices." Aunt Margaret's face flushed with fury. "If she goes through with this, she will be disinherited. I will make certain of it. She will have nothing from me, no support, and no place to return to if this fails." "Then I suppose she will have to succeed," Samuel said quietly. "Because I intend to give her every reason to be glad she chose me." Before Aunt Margaret could respond, Alina appeared at the top of the stairs. She descended quickly, her chin lifted defiantly. "Aunt Margaret, I asked you to let me handle this conversation with Samuel. I am trying to save you from a terrible mistake," Aunt Margaret said, her voice cracking with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Your father entrusted me with your welfare, Alina. I cannot stand by and watch you throw away your future on a cowboy you have known for barely 2 weeks. My future is mine to throw away or to build as I see fit," Alina said firmly. "I am grateful for everything you have done for me, truly I am. But I cannot live my life according to your expectations any longer. I am staying here and I am marrying Samuel with or without your blessing." The silence that followed was heavy and painful. Aunt Margaret stared at Alina, her expression cycling through shock, hurt, and finally cold resignation. "Very well," she said at last. "I will leave for Boston tomorrow as planned. When you realize what you have done and come crawling back, do not expect me to welcome you with open arms." She turned and walked away, her back rigid with offended dignity. Alina watched her go, her composure crumbling the moment her aunt disappeared from view. She sagged against Samuel, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she wept. "I am sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I never wanted to cause a rift between you and your family." "You did not cause it," Alina said, pulling back to wipe her eyes. "That rift has been growing for 2 years. You simply forced it into the open, and I do not regret my choice, Samuel. I meant what I said. I want to marry you and build a life with you, no matter how difficult it may be." "Then we will do it together," Samuel said, cupping her face in his hands. "And I swear to you, Alina, I will do everything in my power to make you happy." They were married 4 days later by the minister at the Dodge City Church, with Mrs. Cooper and the Riley brothers serving as witnesses. Alina wore a simple blue dress she had purchased at the general store, and Samuel wore his cleanest shirt and the trousers he had saved for special occasions. There was no grand celebration, no elaborate ceremony, just 2 people standing before God and promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Alina with a tenderness that made her eyes well with tears. And when they walked out of the church into the bright Kansas sunshine, hand in hand, Samuel felt as though his life was finally, truly beginning. They spent one night at the boarding house, Mrs. Cooper having graciously allowed Alina to share Samuel's room now that they were married. In the morning, they loaded their belongings onto a wagon Samuel had purchased and set out for the ranch, the Riley brothers riding ahead to begin work on the most urgent repairs. The journey that had taken half a day on horseback took nearly a full day with the wagon, but Samuel did not mind. He and Alina sat side by side on the wooden seat, talking about their plans for the ranch and their future together. Alina was full of ideas, from planting a vegetable garden to eventually acquiring chickens and perhaps even a milk cow. Samuel listened with amusement and affection, marveling at her enthusiasm. They arrived at the ranch just as the sun was setting, bathing the neglected buildings in golden light. Jack and Tom had already made visible progress, replacing several boards on the barn and clearing debris from the corral. They greeted Samuel and Alina with wide grins and congratulations on the marriage. Samuel carried Alina over the threshold of the cabin, making her laugh with delight, and set her down gently in the center of the room. It was still dusty and sparse, but Alina moved through it with the confidence of someone who saw not what it was but what it could become. "We will need curtains," she said, examining the windows, "and a larger table and perhaps a proper stove for cooking. Oh, and bookshelves." "We must have bookshelves, Samuel." "Whatever you want," Samuel said, watching her with a smile. "This is your home now too, Alina. You should make it your own." That night, they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread that Alina had cooked on the temperamental stove, and when it was time to say grace, Samuel reached for her hand. They bowed their heads together, and Samuel spoke the words that had been his ritual for 7 years, but this time they were different. "Lord, I thank you for this meal set before me for 2, he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. I thank you for Alina, for her love and courage and faith. I thank you for bringing us together and for the life we are beginning to build. Watch over us and guide us as we walk this path together. Amen. When he opened his eyes, Alina was looking at him with so much love that it took his breath away. That sounded right, she said softly. For two. Samuel smiled, a smile that came from somewhere deep inside him, a place that had been waiting for this moment without even knowing it. Yes, he said. For two. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Samuel and the Riley brothers worked from dawn until dusk repairing buildings, mending fences, and clearing land. Alina threw herself into making the cabin a home, sewing curtains from fabric she ordered from Dodge City, planting a garden, and learning to cook on the stubborn stove. It was hard, exhausting work, and there were moments when Samuel worried that Alina would regret her decision, that the reality of frontier life would prove too harsh for someone of her background. But Alina never complained. She learned quickly, adapting to the rhythms of ranch life with a resilience that amazed him. When the stove refused to light, she patiently coaxed it until the fire caught. When the garden struggled in the harsh sun, she hauled water from the creek to keep it alive. And when Samuel came home each evening covered in dust and sweat, she greeted him with a smile and a kiss that made every hardship worthwhile. They attended church in the nearest town every Sunday, a small settlement called Willow Creek about 15 miles south of the ranch. The congregation was modest, mostly ranchers and their families, and they welcomed Samuel and Alina warmly. Samuel was grateful for the sense of community, for the reminder that they were not entirely alone in the vastness of the prairie. In the evenings, after supper, Samuel and Alina would sit together on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun set and talking about their dreams for the future. Samuel spoke of building the herd, of eventually being able to hire more hands and expand the operation. Alina talked about starting a small school for the children of neighboring ranchers, about filling their own home with children someday. How many children would you want? Alina asked one evening, her head resting on Samuel's shoulder. As many as God sees fit to give us, Samuel said, wrapping his arm around her. Though I confess I would like a house full, I was an only child and I often wished for siblings. I was an only child as well, Alina said. It was lonely at times. I think 3 or 4 children would be wonderful. 3 or 4 sounds perfect, Samuel agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. By late autumn, the ranch was beginning to take shape. The barn was repaired, the corrals were solid, and Samuel had managed to purchase a small herd of cattle from a rancher who was retiring and moving back east. It was not much, just 30 head, but it was a start. The Riley brothers proved themselves to be hardworking and loyal, and Samuel began to think of them not just as hired hands but as friends. Alina's garden had produced enough vegetables to see them through the winter, and she had also learned to preserve food, filling the cabin's small pantry with jars of pickles, tomatoes, and jams. She had transformed the cabin from a dusty bachelor's dwelling into a warm, welcoming home, complete with the bookshelves Samuel had built for her and curtains that fluttered in the breeze from the open windows. In November, Alina realized she was pregnant. She told Samuel one evening after supper, her eyes shining with a mixture of joy and nervousness. Samuel was so overcome with emotion that he could barely speak. He simply pulled her into his arms and held her, thanking God silently for this incredible gift. "Are you happy?" Alina asked, pulling back to look at him. "Happy does not even begin to describe it," Samuel said, his voice hoarse. "I feel like I am living a dream, Alina, a dream I never thought I deserved." "You deserve it more than anyone I know," Alina said, cupping his face in her hands. "You are going to be a wonderful father, Samuel." That winter was harsh, with snow that blanketed the prairie and temperatures that dropped so low the water in the trough froze solid overnight. But the cabin was snug and warm, and Samuel made sure there was always plenty of firewood stacked by the door. Eleanor spent her days sewing tiny clothes for the baby and reading aloud to Samuel from the books on their shelves. He particularly enjoyed the evenings when she would read poetry, her voice soft and melodic, turning words into music. Jack and Tom moved into the bunkhouse Samuel had repaired, and the five of them, including Eleanor, formed a small makeshift family. On Christmas Eve, they all gathered in the cabin for supper, and Samuel said grace with a full heart. "Lord, I thank you for this meal set before us, for the five gathered here tonight. I thank you for the gift of family, for the health and safety you have provided, and for the child you are bringing into our lives. May we always be grateful for your blessings and faithful in our service to you. Amen." When he looked up, everyone was smiling, and Jack raised his tin cup in a toast. To Samuel and Eleanor Carter, the finest folks a man could hope to work for. May your family grow and prosper. "Hear, hear," Tom echoed, and they all drank to the sentiment. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and new grass, and with it came the birth of Samuel and Eleanor's first child. Eleanor went into labor in the early morning hours of April, and Samuel rode hard to fetch the midwife from Willow Creek. It was the longest day of his life, pacing outside the cabin while the midwife and Mrs. Murphy, a neighboring rancher's wife who had come to help, attended to Eleanor. When the midwife finally emerged and told him he had a son, Samuel felt his knees go weak with relief and gratitude. He stepped into the cabin to find Eleanor propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny, red-faced infant in her arms. "Come meet your son," she said softly, and Samuel crossed the room on shaking legs. He looked down at the baby, at the impossibly small fingers and the tuft of dark hair, and felt tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. What should we name him?" Eleanor asked. Samuel thought for a moment. "What about Matthew? It was my father's name." "Matthew Carter," Eleanor said, testing the name. "I love it. Matthew Samuel Carter." "Matthew Samuel Carter," Samuel repeated, reaching down to gently touch his son's cheek. "Welcome to the world, little one. Your mother and I are going to do our best to raise you right." Over the next year, life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that was both challenging and deeply satisfying. The herd grew as Samuel purchased more cattle, and several calves were born in the spring. The ranch began to turn a modest profit, and Samuel sent Eleanor's share to a bank account he had opened in her name, though she insisted they use the money to improve the property. Matthew thrived, growing into a chubby, cheerful baby who seemed fascinated by everything around him. Samuel loved watching Eleanor with their son, the tenderness and patience she showed as she rocked him to sleep or sang him lullabies. He also loved being a father, the way Matthew's face would light up when Samuel came home each evening, the weight of his small body when Samuel held him. They hired another hand, an older man named Pete who had spent his whole life working cattle and had a wealth of knowledge to share. With Pete's help, Samuel was able to expand the operation further, and by the following year they had doubled the size of the herd. Eleanor started the school she had dreamed of, holding classes in the cabin 2 days a week for the children of neighboring ranchers. She taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, and the parents were so grateful that they often paid her with food, firewood, or other goods. It gave Eleanor a sense of purpose beyond managing the household, and Samuel could see how much she loved teaching. On their second wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Eleanor with a new dining table he had built himself, large enough to seat 8 people. "For our growing family," he said, running his hand over the smooth wood. Eleanor laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Are you suggesting we need a larger table, Mr. Carter?" "I am suggesting that I hope we will," Samuel said, pulling her into his arms. "I love you, Eleanor. These past 2 years have been the happiest of my life." "Mine too," Eleanor said, kissing him. "I cannot imagine being anywhere else or with anyone else." That fall, Eleanor became pregnant again, and in the summer of 1881 she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah after Eleanor's mother. Sarah was a quieter baby than Matthew had been, with Eleanor's green eyes and a serious expression that made everyone who saw her smile. Samuel's prayers at mealtimes now included not just Eleanor but also Matthew and Sarah, and each time he said, "For 4," he felt a surge of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. This was the life he had dreamed of but never thought he would have. A wife he loved, children who filled his days with joy, and a ranch that was slowly but surely becoming a success. The years passed, marked by hard work, occasional setbacks, and countless small triumphs. The herd continued to grow, and Samuel was able to build a larger barn and expand the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper parlor. Eleanor's school became a fixture in the community, with children coming from as far as 20 miles away to attend her classes. In 1883, Eleanor gave birth to their 3rd child, another son they named Joseph. And in 1885, she had their 4th and final child, a daughter named Grace. The house that had once seemed too big now felt just right, filled with the noise and laughter of 4 children and the steady presence of the hands who worked the ranch. Samuel and Eleanor's love deepened with each passing year, weathering the challenges that came with raising a family and running a ranch. There were difficult times. A drought one summer that threatened the herd, an illness that swept through the area and left Matthew bedridden for weeks, the death of Tom Riley in a riding accident that left everyone grieving. But through it all, Samuel and Eleanor held fast to each other and to their faith. Every evening, the family gathered around the large dining table for supper, and Samuel would bow his head and say grace. The children knew the ritual by heart, folding their hands and closing their eyes as their father spoke. "Lord, I thank you for this meal set before us for 6, Samuel would say, his voice warm with love and gratitude. "I thank you for Eleanor, for Matthew, Sarah, Joseph, and Grace. I thank you for the blessings you have given us, for the health and strength to do your work, and for the love that binds us together. Watch over this family and keep us in your grace. Amen." And every time he said those words, Samuel would look around the table at his wife and children, and he would smile. It was the smile of a man who had found his purpose, who had been given far more than he had ever dared to hope for. One evening in the spring of 1890, as the family finished supper and the children scattered to their evening chores, Eleanor reached across the table and took Samuel's hand. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked. "How could I forget?" Samuel said with a laugh. "I got shot and you picked up my Bible." "I knew then that you were different," Eleanor said. "The way you thanked me so politely despite being in pain, the way you held that Bible like it was the most precious thing you owned. I think I started falling in love with you that very day." "I started falling in love with you then too," Samuel admitted. "Though it took me a while to realize it. I kept telling myself you were too refined, too educated, too far above me, but you proved me wrong, Eleanor. You proved that love has nothing to do with station or circumstance and everything to do with the courage to choose each other." "We chose well," Eleanor said softly, squeezing his hand. "Look at what we have built, Samuel. Look at our children, our home, our life. This is everything I ever wanted and more than I ever dreamed possible." "I used to say grace for one," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "For 7 years, every meal I prayed for one, and I thought that was my lot in life to be alone, but God had other plans. He brought you into my life, Eleanor, and you changed everything. Now, when I say grace, I pray for 6, and every single time I smile. Because this," he gestured around the table, at the remnants of their meal and the sound of their children's voices drifting in from outside. "This is the answer to every prayer I never had the words to say." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and she rose from her chair to wrap her arms around him. "I love you, Samuel Carter. I will love you until the day I die and every day beyond that if God grants it." "I love you too," Samuel said, holding her close, "with everything I am and everything I will ever be." As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel and Eleanor stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. Matthew, now 11, was teaching Sarah and Joseph how to rope a fence post while little Grace toddled after them, laughing with delight. It was a scene of such simple, profound happiness that Samuel felt his heart might burst. He thought back to the lonely cowboy he had been 12 years ago, saying grace for one and never imagining that life could hold such richness. He thought about the bullet that had sent him sprawling at Aliner's feet, about the Bible she had picked up, about the chain of events that had led them here. "What are you thinking about?" Aliner asked, leaning against him. "I am thinking about grace," Samuel said. "About how it comes in forms we do not expect, how it changes us in ways we cannot predict. I am thinking about how a single moment, a single choice can alter the course of a life. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never met?" Aliner asked. "Sometimes," Samuel admitted. "But not with regret. I believe we were meant to find each other, Aliner. I believe God had a plan all along, even when I could not see it." "I believe that too," Aliner said, "and I am so grateful we had the courage to follow where it led." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into twilight, and Samuel offered up a silent prayer of thanks. For Aliner, for their children, for the ranch that had become more than just a piece of land, but a testament to what two people could build when they loved each other and refused to give up. For the grace that had brought them together and the grace that sustained them every day. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. Matthew grew into a fine young man, strong and responsible, who took over more and more of the ranch work, as Samuel's body began to show the wear of decades of hard labor. Sarah became a teacher like her mother, eventually taking over Aliner's school and expanding it into a proper schoolhouse that served children from all over the county. Joseph proved to have a gift with horses, training them with patience and skill that earned him a reputation throughout Kansas. And Grace, the baby of the family, grew into a spirited young woman with her mother's intelligence and her father's faith. Samuel and Aliner watched their children grow and thrive with pride and gratitude. They saw Matthew marry a girl from Willow Creek and start a family of his own. They celebrated when Sarah accepted a teaching position in Topeka, proud of her ambition even as they missed her presence. They helped Joseph build his own house on the edge of the property, where he could train horses and eventually start his own family. And they delighted in Grace's quick wit and determination, knowing she would accomplish great things. As Samuel grew older, his hair turning silver and his body moving more slowly, he never lost the habit of saying grace before every meal. But now, when the family gathered for Sunday dinners or holiday celebrations, the table was even larger, and the prayer included not just Aliner and their children but also their grandchildren, the growing family that was their legacy. "Lord, I thank you for this meal set before us for 23, Samuel said one Thanksgiving, his voice still strong despite his 70 years. "I thank you for every person gathered around this table, for the generations you have blessed us with, for the love that binds us all together. May we never forget to be grateful, and may we always remember to say grace, not just for the food we eat but for the lives we have been given. Amen." When he opened his eyes, he saw Aliner across the table, her hair white but her eyes still that remarkable green, still looking at him with the same love and admiration she had shown on their wedding day. She smiled at him, and he smiled back, a smile that said everything words could not convey. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Samuel and Aliner sat together in the parlor, the fireplace crackling softly. Aliner was knitting a blanket for their newest grandchild, and Samuel was reading his Bible, the same one Aliner had picked up all those years ago in the dusty street of Dodge City. "Do you have any regrets?" Aliner asked suddenly, setting down her knitting. Samuel looked up, surprised by the question. "About what? About any of it? About marrying me, about the ranch, about the life we chose?" "Not a single one," Samuel said without hesitation. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "Because I know it was not easy," Aliner said. I know there were times when the work was backbreaking, when money was tight, when we faced losses and hardships. I know you could have chosen a different path, an easier path. Easier, perhaps, but not better, Samuel said, setting down his Bible and reaching for her hand. Eleanor, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. This life we built together, this family we raised, this legacy we are leaving behind, it is more than I ever dreamed of. You took a lonely cowboy who said grace for one and gave him a reason to say grace for two, then 4, then 6, and now 23. You gave me everything. Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. You gave me everything too, Samuel. You gave me freedom and purpose and a love I never thought I would find. You taught me what it means to be brave, to choose my own path even when it frightened me. I have never, not for one moment, regretted marrying you. Then we are both blessed beyond measure, Samuel said, pulling her close. And when my time comes, whenever that may be, I will go with a grateful heart, knowing that I lived a good life with a good woman by my side. Do not talk about such things, Eleanor said, though her voice was gentle. We have many more years together, Samuel Carter. I am not ready to let you go. And I am not ready to go, Samuel assured her. I still have grandchildren to spoil and a ranch to help run, but whenever that day comes, I want you to know that I regret nothing. Nothing. They sat together in the firelight, two old people who had weathered decades together and come out stronger for it. And when Samuel finally closed his Bible and helped Eleanor to bed, he offered up one more prayer, silent and heartfelt. Thank you, Lord, for giving me more than I deserved. Thank you for Eleanor, for the grace of loving and being loved. Thank you for every meal we shared, every prayer we prayed, every moment we lived together. And thank you for teaching me that saying grace for two is infinitely sweeter than saying grace for one. Samuel Carter lived to be 78 years old, passing away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1896, with Eleanor holding his hand and his children and grandchildren gathered around. His funeral was attended by nearly everyone in the county, a testament to the respect and affection he had earned over a lifetime of integrity and kindness. Eleanor lived another 12 years, watching her grandchildren grow and her great-grandchildren arrive, always keeping Samuel's memory alive through the stories she told and the love she continued to give. And every evening, before she ate her solitary meal, she would bow her head and say a prayer that echoed the one Samuel had said for so many years. Lord, I thank you for this meal set before me, for one, she would say softly. But I also thank you for the years when I prayed for two, for the love Samuel and I shared, for the family we built together. And I thank you for the promise that one day we will say grace together again, in a place where we will never have to say goodbye. And when Eleanor finally closed her eyes for the last time in 1908, her family knew that she had lived a life of purpose and love, a life that began with a chance meeting in a dusty street and ended with a legacy that would continue for generations. The ranch remained in the Carter family, passed down through Matthew's line, and every Sunday when the family gathered for dinner, someone would always volunteer to say grace. And they would always begin the same way Samuel had, thanking God for the meal and for the people gathered around the table, remembering the cowboy who had taught them that grace was not just about giving thanks for food, but about recognizing the blessings in every aspect of life. The story of Samuel and Eleanor became a family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It was a story about faith and courage, about choosing love over security, about building something meaningful out of hard work and determination. It was a story about a lonely cowboy who said grace for one until the day he met a woman who changed his life, and how that change rippled outward, touching countless lives across the years. And at the heart of that story was a simple truth. That grace, whether spoken at a table or lived in the choices we make, has the power to transform us. It can take a solitary existence and fill it with love, can take uncertainty and turn it into purpose, can take two people from different worlds and bind them together in a partnership that endures beyond death. Samuel Carter said grace for 7 long years, never knowing that he was preparing himself for the day when he would say it for 2. And when that day came, when Alina Whitman picked up his Bible in the street and looked at him with those remarkable green eyes, he smiled. Not just with his mouth, but with his whole heart, because he knew, even then, that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. That smile became a permanent part of who he was, a reflection of the joy and gratitude that filled every day of his marriage to Alina. And when he said grace, whether for 2 or 6 or 23, that smile was always there, a silent acknowledgement of the miracle of love and the grace of God that had brought them together. Years after Samuel's death, one of his great-grandsons asked Alina what made her grandfather so special, what set him apart from other men. Alina thought for a long moment, her aged hands folded in her lap before answering. "Your grandfather was a man who never forgot to be grateful," she said softly. "He said grace before every meal, not out of habit or obligation, but because he truly meant it. He understood that life is a gift, that every moment, every relationship, every blessing is something to be treasured. And when I came into his life, when he finally had someone to share it with, he smiled. He smiled because he knew that grace is sweeter when shared, that joy is multiplied when you have someone to give it to. That is what made him special. He was a man who knew how to say grace, not just with words, but with his life." The great-grandson carried that story with him, and he passed it on to his own children, ensuring that Samuel's legacy would continue. And every time the family gathered, every time someone bowed their head to say grace, they remembered the cowboy who had started it all, the man who had said grace for 1 until the day he smiled and said it for 2. In the end, that is what defines a life well lived, not wealth or fame or accomplishment, but love. Samuel Carter loved deeply, faithfully, without reservation or regret. He loved Alina, he loved his children, he loved his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He loved the land he worked, the animals he tended, the community he served. And through that love, he created something that outlasted his mortal life, a legacy of faith and family that continued to grow and flourish long after he was gone. The ranch still stands today, more than a century after Samuel and Alina built it from almost nothing. The original cabin has been preserved as a kind of family shrine, filled with photographs and mementos that tell the story of 2 people who dared to choose love over convention. And on the wall above the fireplace, in a place of honor, hangs a framed piece of parchment with a single line written in Samuel's careful hand. "Lord, I thank you for this meal set before me for 2. Below it, in Alina's graceful script, is a response. "And I thank you for the cowboy who smiled when he said it." That is the story of Samuel and Alina Carter, a story that began with a bullet and a Bible and ended with a love that transcended time and circumstance. It is a story about grace, both given and received, about the power of faith to sustain us through hardship, and about the courage it takes to follow your heart even when the path ahead is uncertain. It is a story about a cowboy who said grace for 1 until he did not have to anymore, and about the smile that lit his face every single time he said it for 2. And it is a story that reminds us all that the greatest blessings in life are often the ones we never saw coming, the ones that arrive in unexpected moments and change everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our purpose. Samuel Carter found his purpose the day Alina Whitman picked up his Bible in the dusty street of Dodge City. He found it in her eyes, in her courage, in her willingness to take a chance on a cowboy with nothing to offer but hard work and faith. And in finding that purpose, he discovered that grace is not just about thanking God for what we have, but about opening our hearts to what we might receive if we are brave enough to say yes. He said yes to Alina, and she said yes to him, and together they built a life that was greater than the sum of its parts. They faced hardships and celebrated triumphs, raised children and watched them grow, worked until their bodies ached and prayed until their spirits soared. And through it all, They held fast to each other and to the faith that had brought them together. When Samuel bowed his head to say grace, he was not just thanking God for food. He was thanking God for Eleanor, for the miracle of finding someone who saw him not as a rough cowboy, but as a man worthy of love and respect. He was thanking God for the children they brought into the world, for the home they created, for the legacy they would leave behind. He was thanking God for the journey, for every step that had led him from saying grace for one to saying grace for two. And when he smiled, that beautiful, genuine smile that Eleanor loved so much, it was the smile of a man who had found his place in the world. It was the smile of someone who understood that grace is not just a prayer spoken at mealtime, but a way of living, a recognition that we are all dependent on forces greater than ourselves, and that true happiness comes not from what we acquire, but from what we give. Samuel gave his whole heart to Eleanor, and she gave hers to him. Together, they gave their time, their energy, their resources to building something that would outlast them both. And in doing so, they became living examples of what it means to live a life of grace, a life characterized by gratitude, generosity, and unwavering faith. Their story is our story, a reminder that we all have the capacity to transform our lives through love and faith. It challenges us to look beyond our circumstances, to see possibilities where others see only obstacles, to believe that grace is available to us if we are willing to receive it with open hearts and open hands. Samuel Carter said grace for one for 7 years. But he smiled when he finally had to say it for 2. And that smile, preserved in the memories of those who knew him and passed down through generations of Carters, is the ultimate testament to the power of love to heal, to transform, and to endure. In a world that often feels harsh and unforgiving, where loneliness is common and love can seem elusive, the story of Samuel and Eleanor offers hope. It tells us that we are never truly alone if we maintain our faith, that the right person can appear when we least expect it, and that building a life together is the greatest adventure we can undertake. It tells us to say grace, not just for the meals we eat, but for the people we love, for the moments we share, for the blessings we receive, whether large or small. And it tells us to smile, to embrace the joy that comes from sharing our lives with others, to recognize that going from 1 to 2 is not just a change in number, but a transformation of the soul. Samuel and Eleanor Carter lived this truth every day of their lives together. They faced the challenges of frontier life with courage and determination. They raised their children with love and faith. They built a ranch that became a symbol of what can be accomplished through hard work and partnership. And they loved each other with a devotion that never wavered, never diminished, never failed. When Samuel took his last breath, surrounded by the family he and Eleanor had created, his final words were a whisper that only Eleanor could hear. "Thank you for being my grace." And Eleanor, her heart breaking even as it overflowed with gratitude for the years they had shared, whispered back, "And thank you for teaching me how to smile." That is the legacy of Samuel and Eleanor Carter, a love that transformed 2 lonely people into a family, a faith that sustained them through every trial, and a grace that continues to inspire all who hear their story. It is a legacy built on simple rituals like saying grace before meals, on profound commitments like choosing love over comfort, and on the recognition that our lives are measured not by what we accumulate, but by who we become and who we love. The cowboy said grace before every meal for 1 person. He smiled when he finally had to say it for 2, and in that smile was contained all the hope, all the joy, all the grace that makes life worth living. It was the smile of a man who had found his home, not in a place but in a person. It was the smile of someone who understood that the greatest gift we can receive is the privilege of sharing our lives with someone we love. It was the smile of a cowboy who had learned that grace, whether spoken or lived, is always sweeter when there is someone to share it with. And so the story ends where it began, with grace. Grace that brought Samuel and Eleanor together, grace that sustained them through decades of marriage, grace that allowed them to build something beautiful and lasting out of nothing more than love and faith. Grace that reminds us all that we are never truly alone, that love is always possible, and that the simple act of giving thanks can transform not just our meals but our entire lives. Samuel Carter said grace for one until the day he met Eleanor Whitman. Then he said grace for two, and his smile lit up the world. That is a story worth remembering, worth retelling, worth living ourselves. Because in the end, we are all just cowboys looking for someone to share our grace with, someone who will smile with us and walk beside us and remind us that life, for all its hardships, is ultimately a gift to be treasured and shared. The cowboy said grace before every meal for one person. He smiled when he finally had to say it for two. And in that smile was everything that matters: love, faith, gratitude, and the unshakable belief that grace is real and available to all who seek it with humble, open hearts. That is the story of Samuel and Eleanor Carter, a story that will endure as long as there are people who believe in love, who practice faith, and who understand that saying grace is not just about words, but about living a life worthy of the blessings we receive. It is a story that began with a cowboy and a Bible, and ended with a legacy that will continue for generations to come. And it is a story that reminds us all to pause before every meal, to bow our heads in gratitude, and to remember that grace is always present, always available, always ready to transform our lives if we are willing to receive it with joy and thanksgiving. The cowboy knew this truth, lived this truth, and passed it on to all who came after him. And for that, we say our own prayer of thanks, grateful for the example he set and the love he shared and the grace he embodied every single day of his remarkable life.